As if he were a teacher quizzing a classroom of students, Jesus asked his disciples just a few verses before this morning's text, "Who do people say that I am?" They answered with the names of great prophets and figures of faith from the past. Then the teacher asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter gets a pat on the back for giving the right answer. "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." However, he's forced to take a back seat in class for his failure to understand the role of the Messiah. In fact, Jesus said to Peter, "You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." And so shortly after this classroom discussion, Jesus decided to take a few of his brightest students on a field trip to get a better sense of who he was. So he took them mountain climbing, because things always look better from a bird's eye view. But the disciples never could have anticipated just how better things would look once they got to the top. Because it's there that he caught fire from within. His face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. And all of a sudden, the Jesus that they thought they knew looked nothing like the Jesus who stood before them. And there was no question that the one who stood before them was even more true and authentic than the Jesus they had come to know in recent years. And if they needed convincing of that fact, God's voice repeated to them the words that had been spoken at Jesus' baptism. "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased," followed by an admonition to start listening to what Jesus had to say. This transfiguration, then, was a confirmation that Jesus was God's own beloved child. The story may sound strange and supernatural to our modern ears, but today you and I see that transfiguration played out no more vividly than in the coming out experiences of our transgender siblings. Today, however, mountaintop experiences have been replaced in large part with coming out conversations over a vanilla latte served up at the local Starbucks. And still, those coffee shop transfigurations are no less miraculous, no less confusing, and no less awe-inspiring than was the experience of the disciples at the top of this morning's mountain. For it's in those coffee shops that the friend comes to discover that she or he didn't know their classmate nearly as well as they thought they did. It's in those places that the trans hero steps out in a moment of vulnerability to reveal the authentic person who has been living for years within the human shell, who is now clutching the latte in nervous and shaking hands. And the friend who is at as great a loss for words as were the disciples struggles to make sense of the overload of information. And whether God's words are actually heard or not by any of the customers within the Starbucks, they are certainly being spoken at these sacred transfiguration experiences. "This is my beloved child, with whom I am well pleased." But revelations of God are not limited to the transfigurations of bodies. God's love and grace is revealed more often than you might think in what can be thought of as under-the-radar transfiguration experiences. Take, for example, 26-year-old Daniel Black, who was left paralyzed after breaking his back in a cycle accident. Daniel began raising cash that he hoped to use to help himself walk again. But when he heard about 6-year-old Brecon Vaughn, who had cerebral palsy and was in need of an expensive surgery, Daniel was transfigured into a selfless and generous person who gave every penny of the more than $36,000 he had raised to Brecon. God's love was revealed through that transfiguration, and people were inspired to contribute even more donations towards the cost of Brecon's surgery. And there's the customer at a restaurant in which one of the waitresses described an act of kindness by the man who was eating alone and who picked up the bill for a mother and daughter who had started crying during the meal. The man was transfigured from just an ordinary, everyday customer into the embodiment of God's love when he passed a note to the wait staff which read, "Do me a favor and bring me their check. Someone just got diagnosed. Don't tell them." That man's transfiguration before the wait staff embodied God's message that those who suffer are God's beloved children too. There is the neonatal ICU nurse who is transfigured into the embodiment of divine love with the clothes and crib covers she makes for the preemies on the ward. And there's the grieving mom who is transfigured into a personification of encouragement through the foundation she started for parents whose children have died. There's a contractor who was transfigured into the incarnation of compassion when he quit his job and started a nonprofit which rehabilitates homes for the needy. And if we have the eyes to see, our daily encounters with friends and strangers have the potential of actually being mountaintop experiences in which God is revealed and the message is always the same. We are all God's beloved children in whom God is well pleased. But most of us neither have the ears nor the eyes that are necessary for these holy encounters. We are like the disciples in this morning's text, with our feet so rooted in our everyday agendas of life and our heads so engulfed in the thick clouds of our daily routines that we miss out on those experiences. We miss the sacred and the holy moments that are available to us each day. God tells us to open our eyes and listen up, to turn aside from our routine and to make room for the holy mountaintop experience which is taking place in the classroom, the soup kitchen, and the neighborhood Starbucks, places where lives are transfigured from the ordinary into the sublime, and where God's love is revealed in the daily details of life. Wake up, God says. Open your eyes to the miracles I have for you. Listen to what I had to say to you through my beloved child Jesus, who has just taken you mountain climbing. And through my beloved child Nancy, the neighborhood store clerk who is ringing up your chips and soda. And through my beloved child Julio, the waiter who is serving up your double meat Whataburger, hold the pickles extra mustard, please. And through my beloved child, the next door neighbor, whose name you can never remember and who is dying of cancer, but you would never know it because the only time either of you take notice of the other is on trash day when you are setting out your garbage cans. But if we take the time to listen and we take the time to look around us, then our worlds will be transfigured, and our relationships with the clerk and the waiter and the neighbor will be transformed into holy experiences. Oh, we'll resist the experience. You wouldn't think we would resist such an opportunity, but we do. Because it means that we've got to stop and pause from our busy schedules And even beyond that, every time we open ourselves up to a sacred relationship, we are taking a risk. We make ourselves vulnerable to the possibility of rejection, and that frightens us. But God, who is revealed not only within the bright cloud of mystery or the thundering voice from heaven, is also experienced with the gentle touch of a human hand laid upon a shoulder and the words, "Get up and do not be afraid." We read that the disciples, overcome by their experience and paralyzed by it, fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." Make space for the holy in your lives, and don't be afraid. There's more to our lives than our daily routines. God waits to be revealed through the ordinary. That's how God works. Always has and always will. And with the right eyes and the right ears, we might discover that the ordinary is often transformed into the sacred, and we are reminded of God's presence in our lives and intent for our well-being. May it be so in your life and in mine. Amen.